Okay, Brian, we're ready to get started whenever you are.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to our second of 4 programs in the Chamber RVA Shared Values Summit. Last week's session was incredibly powerful and has already generated a lot of the conversation about ways in which we could all engage differently around Richmond's complete history and the actions that we can take as a community. The goal of this series is to deepen our shared knowledge and understanding of our community, its challenges and its opportunities, and explore with local and national experts new ways to think about and act on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to better understand who the Richmond region community is, what we care about, and how we create a future that is different from our past. Today, we're discussing the ways in which philanthropy has shaped our community for better and for worse. We're also going to discuss how we can rethink the role of philanthropy to honor and serve the communities we aspire to support. Mark Kramer has been pondering these questions for years as the co-founder of the Center for Effective Philanthropy and through his work as managing director of FSG, a mission-driven consulting firm focused on reimagining social change. We had the pleasure of virtually meeting Mark recently as he spoke to our chamber board, and we're excited to hear his comments today. It's also exciting to tee up a panel discussion which features 4 of our community's most mission-driven and action-oriented leaders. Together, they represent 4 of the region's strongest foundations: Robbins, the Community Foundation, Cameron, and Richmond Memorial Health Foundation. But they also represent in different ways voices of our community, for they have invested significant portions of their careers, their talents, and their emotional energy in the neighborhoods that others of us may only know from a distance. We'll have time for questions as we move through the afternoon. But first, we want to thank the legion of sponsors and supporters and partners who come together to make this program possible. In 10 weeks, we've gone from an interesting idea to a very powerful opportunity. And we know this experience for each of us and our community will be better because of their involvement. You'll hear from our sponsors throughout today's conversation. Before we begin, let me remind us all of a few housekeeping notes. Today, we'll once again use the tool Mentimeter or menti.com to get engagement from our participants. If you haven't already done so, please go to your phone or a separate browser tab and go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and enter our event code. Please stay muted throughout the session so that we can hear our speakers. Note that we are recording all of the series sessions and they will be available after the series conclusion. In the WebEx platform, participants control how you view your own settings or view your view settings. We advise that you adjust your view to active speaker for the best experience. Finally, if you have a question during today's conversation, please use the chat function and we'll make sure that we get to those questions throughout the conversation. Now, without further ado, let me welcome my friend and board member of the Chamber RVA, Sherry Armstrong, who heads our Community Foundation for the Greater Richmond region, and she's one of our partners on this series. Sherry, welcome to today's conversation.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here. And just on behalf of the Community Foundation, we're really pleased to be partnering with this summit. This is a really important session for our community in light of what we've experienced from the pandemic and the racial injustice and the social unrest at this point in time. It is even more critical than ever that our community begin to have a different conversation and be committed to changing the way Richmond thinks and acts in service to philanthropy. So it's in that spirit that we're here today, and we're very pleased to be part of this dialogue and are committed to, after these series, that we continue to have the hard conversations and be able to align philanthropy in a way that can even have a greater impact. Before we kick off the program, I do want to welcome our next sponsor to say a few remarks. We have Phil Hatfield from Capital One. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a leader in Capital One's small business banking division. I recently joined the chamber board. I've also been a resident of Richmond for 12 years. I'd like to begin by expressing gratitude and appreciation to Brian for his leadership and the entire Chamber staff and board for their dedication and commitment to helping Richmond businesses improve and thrive. I'd also like to thank Sherry for her work at the Community Foundation and Mark and all the panelists for the key roles they're going to play in today's session. Being surrounded by these inspiring and passionate leaders continues to give me hope that we will create positive and transformational change in our community, especially in times when it's so badly needed. This year has shown many of us the important role that philanthropy can play in creating a more collaborative and inclusive solution to address barriers to employment, financial stability, and access to housing. I'm encouraged by the relatively recent wave of commitments we are seeing from the business community at all levels. Recently, Capital One announced the launch of our Impact Initiative, a $200 million 5-year commitment to support growth in underserved communities and to advance socioeconomic mobility by closing gaps in equity and opportunity. The Impact Initiative builds upon Capital One's core mission to change banking for good and its priorities around racial equity, affordable housing, small business support, workforce development, and financial well-being. The initiative is focused on creating a world where everyone has an equal opportunity to prosper by advocating for an inclusive society, building thriving communities, and creating financial tools that enrich lives. Our philanthropic initiatives have always been closely tied to our core business activities. This shows up in a number of ways in Richmond, including our investment in Richmond's small business ecosystem, whether in partnership with the Chamber, the Richmond nonprofit sector, or developing innovative programming at 1717 Carey Street. We know that for our community to thrive, everyone needs opportunity and access to reach upward socioeconomic mobility. Thank you again to the Chamber, today's panelists, and all of the sponsors of the Shared Values Summit for creating space for these conversations and advancing our common interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you to Capital One for all the tremendous commitment you make to our community every single day with your employees who volunteer and all the resources you distribute across your geographies. We really appreciate that. Thank you. So philanthropy in Richmond, especially corporate philanthropy, has evolved tremendously over the years, but we have more work to do if we truly want to be a region that engages its residents in the hard and meaningful work of addressing inequities and creating a sustainable pathway for individuals and communities to break free of our past. There are many people throughout Richmond who have been working on redefining philanthropy, and there are others throughout the country doing similar work. One of these people is Mark Kramer. We're very fortunate to have Mark with us today. He is an author and researcher on how community impact can effectively address community issues. And he's also going to talk to us today about why the connection between business and philanthropy is even more critical to what we are facing in our communities and how we can work even more effectively to address our issues. So Mark, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I hope everybody can hear me. It is a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. You know, I've spent the last 20 years working with companies and foundations on how they can increase their social impact. And we've learned a lot over that time. I think corporations historically have thought about philanthropy as being quite removed from their business operations. And yet we increasingly see that society and business are interdependent. There's probably no greater example of that than the pandemic that we are struggling through right now. It's absolutely clear that without the private sector to run hospitals, to provide protective equipment, to develop vaccines, we could not address this crisis. But it's also true without massive government support, our economy could not withstand and our businesses could not withstand the effect of this crisis. And of course, for millions of people, the social sector, the food banks, the many organizations working in our communities in Richmond and all across the country have been an essential lifeline to getting through the sudden and unexpected financial hardship that so many of them have encountered. And this example may be unique in our experience, but frankly, this idea that business success depends on a healthy society and that a strong society that looks out for the well-being of its members depends on successful and competitive businesses to generate wages and wealth. This is true across every issue that we deal with in our society. And we've seen some really interesting examples of companies moving away from what we've sometimes called a confetti approach to philanthropy, where companies simply give to many, many good, worthy organizations, to begin to concentrate their efforts, to be able to have greater impact, and to focus in specifically on those social issues in the regions where they operate that also affect their business. This isn't about being selfish. The fact is that when companies focus their philanthropy on issues related to their business, they not only have a justification for spending more, but they also have a deep knowledge around those issues, a network of investors and suppliers and employees and customers who all touch those issues. And the company is able to have a disproportionate impact with its resources. I'll give you just a couple examples. You know, Humana, the health insurance company, and has recognized that chronic disease and diabetes is a growing issue in our country. And that in order to reduce the costs and effectively prevent and treat this disease, it requires changes in behavior, changes in the social determinants of health, better access to fresh foods, more knowledge about what good eating habits are, better access to exercise and nutrition. And so Humana has worked in partnership with NGOs and nonprofits across the country to try and change access to fresh foods and to exercise and to raise awareness of the social determinants of health in cities where they have a dominant share of the insured population. They have had a positive impact in a number of cities, and they have also reduced their healthcare costs, they estimate, by several $100 million because of the better access to health that they've been able to provide people. I also think of Cisco Systems, the networking company, which a decade ago realized that although network administration was a terrific career path for people and would enable people often who didn't have a college degree to earn a very good living, there simply weren't enough trained network administrators in the world for Cisco to be able to sell the amount of equipment it wanted to sell to their customers. So they actually worked with nonprofit organizations around the world to launch and develop a distance learning curriculum to train network administrators. They've now trained 4 million network administrators in 150 countries around the world. They have created access to better livelihoods for these millions of people, and they've also reduced a major constraint on the growth of their industry. I'll give you one more example, and it's a small company, a manufacturing company up in Michigan, Cascade Engineering, and they had a problem with the attrition of their workforce. They had a turnover rate in their factories that was close to 60% a year, and this turned out to be a tremendous cost for them. What they realized is that the cause of much of the turnover was not things they were doing wrong within their factory, but was conditions outside of work that were getting in the way of their employees functioning well within work. So things like access to childcare or support when a parent or spouse was sick, emergency loan funds to repair a car that might have broken down and would make it impossible to get to work. Understanding that the causes of absenteeism were not people deciding just to take a day off, but were actually people staying home to take care of a sick relative or dealing with other emergency needs, and therefore creating a more generous approach to handling these excused absences. They began to fund nonprofits in the community that would actually come into the factory and have confidential sessions with their employees to help match them to resources already available in the community that could help meet some of their needs. And they invested heavily in strengthening the nonprofits that were providing the safety net in the region where they operated. This investment has had a transformative effect, not just on the community, but on the business. And their turnover rate has dropped from 60% a year to 5% a year, with tremendous savings for the company. I give you these examples, again, not because I'm suggesting that companies should be selfish and only pursue philanthropy when it helps their own bottom line, but to recognize that the way one operates one's business has tremendous social impact. And philanthropy can be one powerful tool to increase the positive impact of your business in the community and to create greater success for your company. But it also, of course, depends on policies and practices in how you operate your business. I mentioned that over the 20 years I've worked in this space, I've seen a lot of evolution in the thinking about philanthropy. You know, when I started, I think like many people, I assumed that we could solve our social problems if people were just a bit more generous, if we could just give away a bit more money. But what I began to see is that the social sector in the United States is gigantic. We have by far the largest nonprofit sector in the world. And yet, when you look at how we rank compared to other developed countries on basic issues of healthcare, neonatal mortality, educational achievement, upward mobility, racial equity, we are toward the bottom of the list of developed countries. And this really began to puzzle me. I had to ask myself, why is it that with so many hundreds of billions of dollars a year going to philanthropy, we're not making progress on our social problems? And we began to realize that 1.5 million small nonprofit organizations, such as we have in this country, each working independently on its own approach to solving a social problem, generally not collaborating with other nonprofits working on the same issue, in fact, competing with them for funds, generally not collaborating with companies, again, except to ask for contributions, and generally not coordinating with the government, has created a fragmented approach to solving social problems that honestly could use infinite amounts of money, but never actually solve the problems because of a lack of knowledge, alignment, and coordination among the different sectors and among the different players. At FSG, while working for a bank in Ohio, helping them develop their philanthropic strategy about 15 years ago, we discovered that every funder in this community that was interested in funding educational improvement was part of a single effort called Strive that had actually brought together 300 different nonprofit organizations, all of the major companies, the relevant school boards and government agencies, even the Catholic Church that oversaw Catholic schools, and had brought these hundreds of people together, not just once, but to meet in small working groups, each focused on a different aspect of the educational system, and to meet regularly every few weeks for years, to begin to align their approach around a common agenda, to begin to measure their progress in the same way, and to create an infrastructure, a small group of people who could oversee this massive collaboration and ensure the data was collected and analyzed in a meaningful way. We called this approach collective impact, and we wrote an article about it just about 10 years ago. And we have seen tremendous impact around the world, and I know there have been efforts in Richmond as well, to use this collective impact model to try and overcome the fragmentation and isolation of efforts in our nonprofit sector, and to instead focus on how major players like corporations and foundations can bring people together in collaborative efforts to develop a shared approach to solving social problems. We've also seen a real shift in how people think about philanthropy and social change. There's a quote, it's actually from the Baha'i religion, that I came across in a book I read recently that really stuck with me. It said that social change is not a project that one group of people does on behalf of another. It has to be done by the people themselves. And if you could put up the one slide that I sent so that people can see it. This has led us to think more and more about the idea of systems change and how philanthropy can be an effective player in systems change. Now, I asked for this slide because many people talk about systems change, but nobody actually knows what it means. So we've tried to come up with a diagram that lays out one set of definitions around what we mean by systems change. You know, most philanthropy and indeed most government programs focus on this top level of the pyramid. How do you shift policy? How do you shift practices? How do you shift the flow of money and resources? And that's tremendously important. But it turns out, unless you can get beneath that, to change the relationships and power dynamics within society, and beneath that, even more fundamentally, to get at the mental models that govern our behavior and that affect the political will for change, we cannot actually create meaningful and lasting change. And so if you just take as a quick example, the Obamacare that is still so controversial today, so many years after it was first passed, there has been very few changes in American history that has profoundly changed the resource flows, the practices, and the policies around healthcare as Obamacare did. But it didn't change the underlying relationships. The power of lobbying organizations on behalf of insurers and pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies and hospitals. And even more fundamentally, it didn't change the mental model that our population has about healthcare. Because there are some people in the population who think healthcare is a necessity and a right and should be available to all. Some people think that the fact that our companies have to bear the burden of health insurance costs for their employees, unlike companies in most of the rest of the world, actually create a competitive disadvantage for us. But there are many other people in this country who think that healthcare is something that has to be earned. You're only entitled to it if you can afford it, if you have a job. And as long as that mental model prevails, Obamacare will always be controversial and subject to upset. So we've increasingly seen that philanthropists are beginning to focus not just on this top level, but to think about how they can use their influence and resources to affect each of these levels. And of course, Phil mentioned the growing awareness of the issues of racial inequity that have been with us for so many centuries. And there is no place where systems change is more fundamental than in addressing issues of racial equity in our country today. And so, again, we're seeing philanthropists begin to think about how do you change not just resource flows, but mental models and power dynamics. And we're seeing examples of this. You know, to pick one last example, I've just been teaching a course at Harvard Business School on purpose and profit. And one of the examples we use is Dove soap. And we've written this business case on Dove soap. And it's really fascinating because About 15 years ago, they decided that they would focus on women's sense of beauty and self-esteem and body image that is so distorted by the artificial images we see in the media, and that therefore leads women to feel badly about their body image. And this in turn actually affects their behavior in showing up for work and job interviews, in participating in class and school, in joining athletic sports, and many other choices, even to the extent that they're willing to vote in our society. Now you'd think, how could a big company like Unilever and soap like Dove actually change people's attitudes about their self-image and their body image? Well, it turns out, even though this is an important social issue, there were very few nonprofits that were actually focused on this, and there was very little academic knowledge about what kinds of programs would be effective in changing people's perception of themselves. And so Dove invested heavily in developing the knowledge to create programs that they could then launch with Girl Scouts of America, with the Boys and Girls Clubs, with other ways of reaching youth to try and actually change their perceptions of themselves. And through academic studies done by third-party researchers at Harvard and London School of Hygiene, they were actually able to demonstrate that their philanthropic programs have had a meaningful impact in many communities around the world in improving people's self-image and self-esteem related to their body image. That's getting at changing mental models. So I just want to leave time for questions, and I want to wrap up here. I want to throw out one final thought. One of the consequences of thinking about systems change is to understand the power imbalance between donors and beneficiaries. And the problem with that, there are many problems, but one of the key problems is it's very easy for donors to think that they have the answers that will solve the problems of beneficiaries, even though the donors have no life experience to draw on that is comparable to the life experience of the beneficiary. We're increasingly seeing that we need to listen to the beneficiaries in order to develop effective philanthropic strategies. And there's one approach that has impressed me deeply over the years. It's called positive deviance. There's a book by Jerry and Monique Sternin called The Power of Positive Deviance, which I strongly recommend. Their research has shown that on any issue, there is a subset of people who are affected by the problem who have actually found a solution to it. Their behavior deviates from the norm in a positive way. And so one example, they worked in Vietnam around issues of childhood malnutrition. And there had been UN programs that came in and donated food and milk, and that was great. But when the money ran out, those programs went away, and the village returned to the malnutrition that they had suffered from before. Well, the researchers went door to door in this village to identify homes where children were actually not malnourished. And then they sent anthropologists in to study what were the mothers and fathers doing differently in those homes. And they were found there were a number of simple practices, foods that were given to the children that the community norms thought were not appropriate for children. When serving soup, actually not saving all of the good stuff at the bottom of the soup for the father, but giving some of that, ladling some of that to the child. They came up with a dozen different solutions to malnutrition in this community in Vietnam that they were then able to have mothers share with each other. And without needing external resources, without bringing in outside consultants, they were able to solve in a permanent way the problem of malnutrition in this community simply by finding the people who already had figured out answers and enabling others to learn from them and follow those approaches. So this idea that we as philanthropists may not have the answers, that we need to deal with all of these squishy things like mental models, and that we need to actually be guided by the beneficiaries in finding solutions. These, I think, are some of the most fundamental changes that I've seen in the practice of philanthropy over the last 20 years. So I want to stop there and create the opportunity for questions. I think we have a few minutes left. So please share in chat your questions. And I see one question about Cascade Engineering in Michigan. It is a small manufacturing firm that has actually gotten quite a bit of attention for what they have done, both around racial equity and other practices that have improved retention so dramatically and made their employees better off. And I see another question: how did the group that did the study of the impact Unilever made determine that they made an impact? Yeah, that's a more complicated question. And there is a teaching case, Dove's Real Beauty campaign on the Harvard Business School website, you're welcome to. But basically, they were able to test control groups that had experienced different programs. Some of them were very brief programs, videos and films. Others were multi-day programs that were done by the Girl Scouts or by teachers in schools. And to actually assess on various standardized tests people's self-image both before and afterwards. And then they were able to repeat this about 6 months or a year later to see if there was a lasting impact. And of course, it's a complicated issue. I would overstate it if I said they solved the problem completely, but they certainly were able to see progress and document that. I see another question now, James: as we continue to see government hesitate to respond to community need because of political infighting, how do nonprofits and philanthropists collaborate in that vacuum? Boy, that is a hard challenge. I have to say that I think, in my experience, there is much greater hope for collaboration on the local level than on the national level. We have seen that even when you bring people together from different political perspectives, different points of view, when you begin to talk about the needs in your own community, it is much easier to come up with common ground and to begin to work together toward these solutions. I mentioned this collective impact approach that tries to bring together players from business, government, and the social sector to find a common agenda to solve a social problem. What we found is that common agenda, which seems like it should be obvious, can take 6 months or a year or 2 years for people to agree on. But what happens in that process of coming to an agreement is the beginnings of building of trust across these different sectors within this group. And we often say that collective impact works at the pace of trust. It is that trust that is essential for collaboration. And again, we do see it possible in local communities, even though our nation as a whole is so divided. I'm just sort of looking up and down the chat now and going to just sort of pick some questions I see. Do you think the effort by white folks to learn about systemic racism will affect our mental models about racism in the US? Yes, I do. And I will say that from personal experience. I am deeply, deeply embarrassed to say that I've spent more than 20 years, close to 30 years, working in different ways in the social sector as a philanthropist, as a consultant, as an academic, without beginning to understand systemic racism. It's only in the last 5 to 10 years that I have begun to educate and be educated about systemic racism. And it has opened my eyes to blind spots that I never understood. It has fundamentally changed my thinking about social progress in this country and about how philanthropy can effectively operate. It has certainly changed my mental model. It's not easy. It requires acknowledging the white privilege that has enabled me to stand in the position of power that I now stand in. And it has enabled me to look through new glasses at everything around me. But it has taken years reading, working with consultants, going through experiential programs, having consultants come in and diagnose at our own firm, FSG, what circumstances were, that has enabled me to see what I was so blind to before. I think that this is a process that we all must go through to be effective philanthropists. Question about the Power of Positive Deviance book. The author is Jerry and Monique Sternin, Sternin, and I recommend it highly. I see another question here that, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get my chat to move, and it's not moving for me. There we go. Successful examples of how philanthropic organizations have encouraged local nonprofits to collaborate around a shared mission or goal. Sure. As a philanthropy, you have the power to get nonprofits to come to the table. You can't impose your agenda. This has to be an open agenda that is collectively developed by the nonprofits working together. But merely by asking them to come together, and merely by the fact that you're making grants to support them, they will come together. I think what's important that many people don't understand is that collective impact is not just about nonprofit collaboration. To work, it has to engage government agencies, it has to engage businesses. You know, social problems exist not because we can't think of a solution, but because they are held in place by the system that currently operates. You know, we know how to make a good school, but when you begin to apply that to the problems in our inner city schools, you run into the challenges of teachers' unions that don't want teachers to be fired, the challenges of property taxes that are unevenly allocated to school districts, the challenge of a political agenda that would want certain things in the curriculum and not others, the fact that if you don't have good health care, if you don't have adequate food, you're not going to succeed well in school. All of these things are why our schools are failing. And no one single nonprofit is going to solve the answer. And even nonprofits working together are not going to provide the answer. We need to approach these problems holistically. We need to start out by mapping the system. Who are all the different players who touch on this social issue and are part of why it continues to stay in place? And then how do we get all of them to the table and hold them there to begin to build trust, to find that common agenda, to measure progress in the same way, and to create actual solutions and progress? I'm going to keep going with a few more questions, Sherry, until you stop me and tell me the time.
Yeah, I think we have 1 more minute. Mark, maybe you take one more and then we'll go with the bigger question to the group.
Okay, so here's a question. What type of businesses can best leverage philanthropic priorities to hire the best and brightest employees? Businesses that have seriously embraced a social purpose as part of their enterprise are going to attract the best and brightest employees. Part of that social purpose can be developed through your philanthropy, but much of it really has to come through your business model. Another case I've taught this year at Harvard is on PayPal. And PayPal has become an amazingly successful financial services company. And they have a very strong social purpose, which is to democratize access to financial services, focusing on providing secure and inexpensive money transfer for those with the fewest resources that banks do not traditionally serve because of their overhead structure. This has led them, for example, to create a new working capital product that has been immensely successful in providing small loans to businesses, many of them led by women and people of color, who were not able to access credit from major banks. This has now resulted in $14 billion of lending to small businesses in the United States and been a very successful product. And it is in part driven by PayPal's sincere commitment to this social purpose. And I can tell you that the CEO, Dan Schulman, if he were here, would tell you that that commitment to social purpose is what has enabled them to compete for the best employees in Silicon Valley so successfully. So let me stop there, Sherry. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Thank you very much. Now going to share a question in Mentimeter, or we'd actually like you to respond to this question. What is one of the key takeaways from Mark Kramer that's important for Richmond to have heard? See any responses? Sam, I hope, oh, here we go. Good, yep. Collaborative efforts require time, a really critical point. This is messy, messy work, and you've got to have the patience to stick with it. Works at the pace of trust, really important, I think, is one key component Mark talked about. We've got to have the beneficiary in the conversation, and we've got to build trust as institutions. A lot of good answers here. Importance of bringing all sectors together. It's the three-legged stool effect that really, I think, gives us the greatest opportunity. Another interesting point, I think the collaboration is not just for the nonprofit sector, it's across all sectors. Our social service sector is inclusive of more than just the nonprofit sector, and it's going to be key to do that. Really, really great answers. Thank you all for responding. And I think really just some a good finale, I think, Mark, to your point. Thanks so much for driving it home for us. And these are going to be really critical elements as we move forward in the community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sherry.
Just a couple other takeaways as we move into the next sector, or just to sort of wrap this up, just from my perspective and my colleagues' perspective that work in the community. The key thing I think about this is it really is long-term. And sometimes what's challenging, particularly I say this a bit to the business community, to stick with something for a long period of time and be with the social sector in moving to those kinds of outcomes is really critical. And some of the success we've seen with initiatives in our community, when we've all been somewhat aligned for a long period of time, we've been able to see the kind of change moving forward. And to all of us on this call, that's going to be even more critical as we move forward. When we talk about trying to deal with or overcome racial equity and the injustice around race, that didn't just happen 10, 50 years ago. We've been living with this for a long time. So our commitment with our resources and our time and our ability to come together and work collectively, we're going to have to be in it for the long term and understand it's messy work and try to work really hard, I think, to stay true to what we're trying to accomplish. But Mark, you're a great inspiration. Appreciate you being here. We really thank you. And lots of great nuggets to take from your presentation to move us forward. So thank you. So as we move into the next segment, we also now have the opportunity to have one of our sponsors. Sorry about the echo. I'd like to introduce Margaret Ann Bollmeyer, who is head of the MCV Foundation, and I want to thank her for being with us today and being a sponsor for the session.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you so much. I'm Margaret Ann Bollmeyer, president of the Medical College of Virginia Foundation. Our mission is to inspire philanthropy and steward funds that support VCU's patient care, research, and educational mission on the MCV campus of VCU. Mark, I want to just join so many others in thanking you for being here today and sharing your experience and ideas with us. It was inspirational, and it will give us a lot to talk about for a long time. I'm very encouraged that the Chamber has organized this Shared Values Summit and is convening these important conversations. As we have all seen, the pandemic has made clear that there are widespread issues in healthcare equity and access. What inspires me about MCV Foundation's work is VCU's commitment to serving all people in our community to build a healthier Richmond for everyone. VCU operates the Commonwealth's largest safety net hospital. We see more patients who are uninsured or covered by Medicaid than any other hospital in the state. And we also commit to providing the same excellent medical care to every patient, regardless of whether they have a platinum insurance plan or no coverage at all. This safety net extends to cancer care at Massey Cancer Center, which consistently leads the country's National Cancer Institute designated cancer centers in the number of indigent patients served. And we have taken our work out into the community to increase access to cancer screening and care appointments. 2 years ago, MCV Foundation supported the launch of VCU's Medical Legal Partnership, which offers medical and legal services to patients to address unmet civil legal needs of vulnerable patients. This growing program provides free aid to low-income patients by partnering with the legal and business community to address social determinants of health, by intervening in unlawful evictions, poor housing conditions, insurance and public benefit denials, employment discrimination, and domestic violence. Dominion Energy is one of many partners in this program that provided more than 720 hours of pro bono legal services to 127 patients and families last year. But there is so much more we must do. Like all of us gathered here today, I'm looking forward to hearing from our next group of panelists about the role of philanthropy, and most importantly, how, as Mark discussed, how philanthropic organizations may work with the business community and government to address issues of social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion that are persistent and prevalent in our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret Ann, and thanks for all the tremendous work you do. I mean, especially through COVID, MCV, VCU, strong partners to all of us in the community. So thank you very much. I am pleased to introduce our next panel. We are going to be talking about philanthropy in Black and Brown communities, responsive philanthropy in our Black and Brown communities. And I'm very pleased to introduce my friends and colleagues who will be part of this panel. We have Robert George, who is with the Robbins Foundation and going to moderate. We've got Jill Coleman, the Cameron Foundation, Stephanie Glenn on my team at the Community Foundation, and Albert Walker, Richmond Memorial Health Foundation. Thank you all for being here today, and we look forward to your remarks and your great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry, and good afternoon, everyone. It is definitely, this is a great opportunity, and how timely is this conversation that we're having on today with all that has happened in 2020. And I think Marcus, we do thank him for his comments and his feedback that he shared with us today. And we also thank the Chamber for creating the space for us to have this conversation, because as we look at 2020, some would say that what COVID-19 and the pandemic has done is that it has revealed, it has exposed, amplified, and accelerated health disparities, education disparities, housing and economic disparities that are impacting Black and Brown communities. And then we look at that many of us witnessed the murder of George Floyd, which has been a wake-up call if we think about how it has sparked conversations about racial equity, social justice, and why Black lives matter. And at the same time, it has created an opportunity for us to reimagine how philanthropy can work with Black and Brown communities. And I think before we get started with this conversation, I think we have to acknowledge that as we were preparing, that this is a challenging and hard conversation. That this is not a straight line, that we have been dealing with these issues here in Virginia for over 400 years. And so it's saying, how can we have honest conversations that's needed to help move us forward? So while they are hard, we want to be able to today have an honest conversation and saying, how can we have an honest conversation? How do we create a space to hear the diverse perspectives that others are bringing about how we can move forward? And then how can the conversations be forward thinking and helpful in creating the type of region that, regardless of zip code, regardless of economic status, regardless of race, that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be able to thrive and succeed in this region. And in doing that, it creates a better region for all of us. And so it's our hope today as we embark on this, that this conversation can contribute to how philanthropy can be responsive, how we can be in partnership with working with Black and Brown communities to not only strengthen Black and Brown communities, but to strengthen and make this a better region. And so we want to start this conversation, and we want to start with the first question that we want to ask. And I want to start with Jill. Jill, why is it important to work with Black and Brown communities? Because that's sometimes that, people are having this conversation, but why is it important to work with Black and Brown communities?
Well, it's very important because as we have seen before, and even more so now, Black and Brown communities are more strapped than ever before. The virus affected them in a larger way. The economic fallout from the virus. And then when you talk about the social injustice, instead of justice, we want to call it social injustice. You're looking at, like Mark saying, the donor and the beneficiary. I am the observer and the victim, because Black and Brown people feel it. This is our brothers and cousins and aunties and aunts that are getting killed. And so we really have to make sure that we talk with those communities that we say we serve, because oftentimes, as I'm in philanthropy, I'm in that space. And so sometimes I'm a little strapped because I am the donor and the beneficiary. And we have to start looking internally and saying, what are we doing to make sure that we are moving the needle? And because it is a needle, it really is not huge steps. We're moving it as best we can, but we have to keep in mind some of the challenges that these communities have that we haven't gotten past, we haven't fixed, so to speak. Mark used an example about positive deviance and working in larger communities in other countries. And what I like to think about is an example that I heard years ago in Ecuador. We were talking to this father and said, why are you not sending your kid to school? Education is very important. The kid it's time for the kid to go to school. He's time for first grade. And the father said, well, the storm came and my goats got away. And so I need the kid to help me build the fence back up so I can keep my goat in so I can feed the kid. So we have to make sure that we look at the full picture as donors and beneficiaries so that philanthropy moves the needle and our communities, Black and Brown, which are most impacted, move it. They have the opportunity to participate on both sides of the discussion. So that's why we must have them at the table. But also, Robert, and we didn't talk about this the other day, one thing that we have to do is we have to be careful grouping Black and Brown people. Brown people have a lot of different issues than Black people, and Black people have a lot of different issues than Brown people. And so I want to speak for both people, but I'm finding it more and more difficult to do it.
That's a helpful distinction to make, to talk about how do we begin to disaggregate, because we realize that Black and Brown communities are different, but even when you look at within Black communities, they're even different. And so how do you deal with, and I want to go to Stephanie with this. How do you deal with one, because I know you all recently did a study on Black philanthropy, but how do you deal with the differences of the Black community, and how do you approach the differences of the Black community, that it's not one size fits all? And so how do you approach that, and how have you approached that in 2020?
Thank you so much, Robert. I believe that with philanthropy and what we've been doing recently with the Giving Black study is it's about the voice. I say that Black and Brown communities are at the forefront now more than ever because they have been the voiceless for so long. Or our voice had been determined for us. And so if I were to talk about the Giving Black study for Greater Richmond, it was an opportunity to tap into the voices of Black people and African Americans in our region, where before studies were done on us about our deficits. 30% are African Americans are in poverty. 60% of the graduation rate is low, and that wasn't counting the African American children. They even, you talk about the business world, will do studies around our spending habits so that they can learn and understand how to market to us in the econ world. Well, when it comes to philanthropy and the Giving Black study, really for the first time asking Black people, how do they invest in their community? We're not just consumers of goods and services, but we are also people who care and have passion as well. And that has been nothing new. That's been since the beginning of time. And so when philanthropy was created, we weren't at the table. And so through these years that philanthropy has been around, and particularly the 50 years of the Community Foundation, really evolving to say there's more to the community than the original traditional institutional donor. And it's time to look into our community of Black people, and that's where we're starting. That won't be the end, but that's where we're starting, and find out what are their characteristics of giving? What's their heart and passion of giving? What's their understanding of giving? Some do it so selflessly, they're not even realizing that they are philanthropists in the traditional sense. And so what the study was able to do is to really look at the characteristics of a giver, but to ask an individual Black person, how do they connect in their community financially, through talent, and through treasure. And it was really interesting through that process because honestly, some of the comments that were made during that time indicated that they were never asked that particular question before. So we were on the cutting edge of this work. And I think the other unique thing about this, I have to bring up with the Giving Black study, is that it was in partnership with the foundation. But our strong partner leads was Ujima Legacy Fund, which is an African-American giving circle connected to the foundation led by African men in the community, and Sister Fund, which is all African-American women giving circle who were at the forefront of this work alongside the Community Foundation. That in itself is paramount. In a time really such as this. We embarked on that journey 2 years ago. So it's so ironic, Robert, that as we are concluding the study and again going to begin the real work of this study here, that it concluded during a time of the most highest social unrest that we've seen in Richmond in a long time.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to talk more about that when we get a little bit further on in the conversation. But Albert, I want to talk to you because Stephanie said something very interesting about voice. And Mark talked earlier about the idea of the shifting of the mindset. So can I ask you, what shifts in mindset and narrative need to happen in philanthropy to think about how we work here in Richmond with Black and Brown community?
I will leave it to you, Robert, to ask me such a big question. So if I'm thinking of it right, we really do have to really begin to start interrogating our own practices and ways of doing work. Mark talks about the beneficiaries knowing what's best. I like to say, we have to get proximate in communities. And what I mean by proximate, that we're close in relationship and not just being there in a resource or a funding way, but beyond our funding, what are we doing to be allies, to be neighbors, to be kin, if you will, with communities in our region. And so, this work that's going to be required ahead of us is going to be counterintuitive. And so, like, what does it really mean to get on the ground with folks, and how do we do that in a way that makes good sense? I think, in terms of mental models, I think we have been used to, instead of being proximate, we would settle for proxies. And so we would take proxy data, or we would take, we'll lump all people in one general category. And so we need to move beyond, having proxy relationships with communities, maybe through our nonprofit partners in geographic areas, but actually get more proximate, where we are developing relationships. And I love how Mark put it. I mean, those are the relationships, and the connections are important. And that's not just funding. I mean, you have to actually get on the ground with people and understand, why the goats are getting out the gate, right? And also beyond that, as you are working and on the ground with people, you'll begin to see that your own mental models will have to shift. I mean, because once you number yourself with a person, your eyes become open. And once your eyes become open, you can't really close them. And so, the thought here is to kind of get proximate, to kind of move away from proxy to proximate, and really numbering ourselves and becoming kin with people. And so, and I'll say this and I'll be quiet, the way that our worlds are set up, the way where we live, we just aren't in communion with each other. We just, our social lives outside of work, our social lives prevent us from being in close contact with everyday ordinary people. And so, so the challenge there is, like, how might I rethink being in relationships in communities? And so I hope that helps.
So I think that's a great. So I think that's a great point. So that's what I really want to go into the next question to ask you all. What steps have your foundations really taken to get proximate with Black and Brown communities, and to become aware of the issues impacting Brown and Black communities? And then what advice would you give to those who are saying, I want to get proximate and I want to reimagine how I'm working with Black and Brown communities? And so if you all can, and I'll start with you this time, Stephanie, what steps have you all taken at the Community Foundation, to use the word Albert said, to get proximate, to become aware of the issues impacting Black and Brown communities? And what advice would you give those who are wanting to build relationships with Black and Brown communities?
Sure. The foundation has been around now 52 years, and the previous founder and president and her co-founders did an amazing job building an institution in a time during 1968, where at that time we know that there was social unrest, and recognized that philanthropy can be a way to bridge gaps, convene conversations, and those who were interested in investing in the community to make it better, they had the opportunity to do so. I would say within the last 5 years, under the leadership of Sherry Armstrong, the foundation looks a little different as it did in the previous years. And I think that's a testament to really honing in on the name Community Foundation and our motto of together we do more good. As you looked around the foundation, realizing that at the time it didn't really reflect voices from the community. And without shouting it through the rooftops, Sherry has strategically started to turn the foundation into a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable place to work, just by putting staff in seats that look different from one another, by appointing the first Black woman chair of a board, by really asking those who work here in diverse positions and how they look diversely different, our input, which is all really important. Really, my role as Vice President of Diversity Engagement came out of a journey that we embarked on, as I mentioned, the Giving Black study. We started that study before the current social unrest, but it was really important to Sherry and the team and the board to start to just look into the community as a whole and start to have individuals who didn't before have a voice to now have a voice. And philanthropy and DEI work is not about counting the number of staff you have. It's not about the increase of board members that we do have. It's not about celebrating this Black board chair that we do have. It's not about, myself being the first Black executive at a foundation in this role, and to have a diversity and engagement team part of what we're doing. But I think it's when we talk about what we're doing on the inside, we're leading from our seats. Really important to how we were shifting this work. Prior to the social unrest, our civic innovation team, led by Vanessa Diamond, and our community engagement team, led by Scott Blackwell, were already in the trenches, trying to think differently, thinking outside the box, being bold with projects like Mending Walls, with grants being made to grassroots organizations that typically and historically would not have been able to be instilled. Putting myself in position to cultivate stronger and deeper relationships with our diverse giving circles that are right here, our Impact 100 who are women, but then obviously our African-American women and Black giving circles, to really take advantage of the community, as Albert said, around us, and to not just congregate within the meeting, but really try to get a great understanding of each of those groups and how can we partner deeper, and how can we lean on those voices to further our work. In the culminating events of all that, we at times such as this, we were able to, in partnership with the executive leadership of Sister Fund and Ujima Legacy Fund, we have a fund that is called a Mandala Fund for Social and Racial Justice. It is the first fund of its kind in our region, and it has been powered by Dominion Energy, Altria, and Community Foundation, and many other donors, to say this fund, first of its kind, will mobilize investments to strengthen the Black community to achieve racial justice. Coming from a traditional community foundation, championing some work around social and racial justice, I say is quite some wins in terms of not transforming philanthropy, that's not the right word, but evolving philanthropy into creating avenues and new avenues and new directions for those to expand who can be a part of bridging gaps, convening, learning, understanding, and then ultimately supporting those who need the help and not the handout, those who need the hand up, because that's what this is all about.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. So, Jill, I want to come back to you because of something you said about that we are, while we're in these roles, at the same time we are victims because we're people of color, and we're seeing persons who look like us, who look like our brothers and our sisters, who are experiencing this trauma and this injustice. So can you tell me, what lessons have you learned from this, and how is this impacting how you approach the work at Cameron?
Okay, well, first of all, as a segue to what Stephanie said, one lesson that I learned was that the power of being in place and having some structure to receive award like Amanda received from those organizations she mentioned, because had not Sister Fund been in place and had not Ujima been in place, we would not have been able to expand our work by forming a mandala. And so inside of your disappointment, you have to celebrate your appointment. I am in a space where, as vice president of a foundation, I am oftentimes challenged with what can I do and what can't I do. But we have to learn that framing the decision sometimes, but not making it, can be costly. But at the same time, you're still at the table trying to make things happen. And so that's one of the lessons that I learned and that I had to really grapple with. I have to say, don't leave, don't leave the table. Don't be upset that so much that you are not able to do what you're able to do. And though that's a space that I'm sure Robert, all of us have talked about, that we find ourselves in. But and we have mentors and friends, and you're like, oh my goodness, and they're like, stay there, because so many other folks stayed there for us, and we're here because they stayed there. And I've got to stay. I've got to grapple with it, but I have to do the work, and the hard work of the Black Giving Circles, the Black Giving Study, which reminded us of just how much monies that Black and Brown people give in terms of being donors, how much it is that we give. And so we were able to grow that effort by being in the places we are, by being at Cameron, by being in Sister Fund, by constantly learning, by keeping abreast of the two sides, and so to speak, if I can say, the two faces that we wear in this strapped environment where we are framing decisions, even if we're not making them.
Well, Du Bois talked about that in the Soul of Black People.
Yeah.
Paul Laurence Dunbar talked about that in his poetry. And so I think, the question is that we're in this space where we look like the community, and that could be my brother. And many of us have experienced, like, I know what it's like to be stopped by the police and to have a weapon pulled on me. I understand that feeling and that dynamic, and yet at the same time, we're at the table, and how can we stay engaged in a way that can be meaningful and helpful in helping others to understand, others who may not look like us, to understand what that's like. And so I want to, because I think that's a great point, but as I look at it, I want to make sure we open it up, because we have a number of folks here to ask your questions and send your questions. And Sherry, I want to get you to kind of see some of the questions that may be coming in, that we want to be able to answer any questions that the audience have, because we want this to be a conversation, not just with the panel, but with the audience. And we want to be able to answer any of the questions that you may be having, to say, okay, now how do we shift mindset? What lessons have you learned during this time? And questions that you may have, and if you can put some of that into the chat, it would be great. And then we'll start answering some of those questions. But Albert, I want to go back to you, because I think this idea of, we're talking about working with communities, and that we're in this very unique space, being people of color who are working in philanthropy. What is your foundation? What are your foundations doing to build trust with Black communities? How are you building the trust that's necessary to be successful in working with Black communities, especially after there have been some tensions sometimes with philanthropy, working with Black-led nonprofits, or working in Black and Brown communities? How do you build the trust that's necessary to be successful and to have the type of impact we're talking about?
Yeah, so trust is a long journey, and so I think the foundation started this trust journey by first inviting some members of the community to give them some recommendations on how the foundation should act. And so they invited some nonprofit leaders, the Health and Equity Fellows class, and what they did was these groups of fellows worked over a year, and they came up with 4 things, right? 4 big things. One, we needed to address the historical harms of the different racist policies and practices, and they need to be addressed. Two, these fellows told us that health and health equity is more than just healthcare. So as a health legacy foundation, that's something we had to wrestle with. Third, they told us that philanthropy and what we do is a vehicle for this change. And then fourth, they were saying that the authentic and long-lasting regional collaboration around health equity is rare. And so we had to take these four things and figure out what to do with it. And so when you talk about building trust, you got to hear from people, but then you have to respond to what folks are saying. And so when we talk about the historic harms of racist policies and practices to be addressed, we're about to launch, we're launching the HEAL initiative, which simply stands for Health Equity Action Leadership, where we're working in communities, most affected by health inequity, Black and brown communities. And we're going to have a policy and advocacy lens that'll be starting soon up. And so that's part of the thing. So when you build this kind of trust, you got to respond and do some things. When we talk about health, being health is more than just health care. Our foundation has historically invested in the health safety net and in health systems, and that's fine. We continue to do that. They have a lion's share of the work, but we've also figured out ways to invest more upstream. And so when we talk about healthcare is a downstream approach, because if you've already gotten to the hospital or the clinic, you're already sick. And so what they're saying is the investments need to move upstream into the living conditions of where people live. Right? And to go even upstream, you have to even talk about race. You can't talk about health without. And then that philanthropy is a vehicle for that. And so we've used our role as a convener to bring different stakeholders together. We try to matchmake. The light fell. It's all good. We tried to bring different policy and advocacy groups together to help with nonprofits. And then fourth, this long-lasting regional collaboration around health equity is rare. And so I think this is a real opportunity for us now. There are many business leaders on this call. I would say, and I don't speak for the foundation, train me well not to speak, but I would say we need business at the table with us looking at health equity in this way. I would love to have conversations in the business sector, people who are interested in working proximate in communities about addressing some of these social conditions. And so how you build trust, you just gotta listen to the things that folks are doing. And so we have some real promising initiatives. I mean, Kendra's doing work with her Hardest program, reimagining communities. Lisa's working with the health safety net, but also moving in oral health and behavioral health. And Michael's launching some promising work with some grassroots organizations. And so it's a long journey. And so, but it's one, responding to what you hear, and you got to be in relationships with people to be able to do that.
So thank you for that. And I think we have a comment. We have a comment in the chat section, and I think this is very important to really say, how do we make that shift when we're not just talking about mindset? How do we shift from always, when we're talking about Black and brown communities, is from a deficit-based approach where oftentimes we're talking about what's wrong with Black and brown communities, instead of talking about maybe something is wrong with the systems, or instead of talking about the assets of Black and brown communities. So can we talk about what is your foundation doing, and what has it done to kind of shift the approach from a deficit-based approach to one, an asset-based approach, and also the beginning to look at the systems. And so I'm going to ask that question to you, Stephanie. What's happening at the Community Foundation, and how you're working with Black and Brown communities, but how you're shifting from a deficit approach to more of an asset-based approach and looking at systemic change?
That's a great question, Robert. I would certainly say that we are currently in a learning, listening phase. The approach that we want to move forward with, though, is that we are doing our work across the foundation with a DEI lens, with an equity lens specifically, and a racial equity lens more prominently, which has not been the case before. And to the point of the question in the chat, that is so imperative as we're talking to specific donors, as we are approaching grant season and really looking at questions we're asking these nonprofits who are serving the people who had the consequence of slavery these many years and generations down the line, really being more intentional around learning about those systematic issues or consequences of racism, and using that information to provide convenings and education for those who may not be completely aware, or for those who are completely aware, and we can continue to elevate their voice as they had already been trying to transform the conversation around that piece. But we are encouraging all staff within the organization to listen and learn and to bring voice and different perspectives as we are going on this journey. And journey, I say, this is we've begun it a few years ago, but now we are honing in, extremely intentional around how we're going to move in the future. We're leaning on those who may know better, leaning on those who have done better to inform us in our work. And then I will also say to that, you know, when it comes to the systematic racism piece, and I talk about leading from our seats, you know, there was a discussion in one of our meetings around that slavery time and using the word slave. And so in that conversation, we were able to talk about how, for me, last year, I believe it was the first time that I heard it explained in a way that Black people were never slaves, they were enslaved. Now I'm well in my 40s, and to hear it that way totally, to me, changed the historical value of my history. Because now I can tell my son his history did not start in slavery. His history was that people came to a land where there were kings and queens and mothers and fathers and entrepreneurs and sisters and aunts, and brought them to a land to enslave them for 400 years. And so, to the point of the question, I think it's about having those types of conversations within philanthropy among colleagues, having those types of conversations in business meetings and partnerships to really start to, and I know that's a very small snapshot in history, but it was so profound to me to change that one narrative of a systematic change. So, because and still you're thinking now, if we've called a people slave for over 400 years, and most of those people, males in particular, are incarcerated, and we here in philanthropy have reform programs as incarcerated individuals come out to get them back on their feet, then we need to help to understand and find a way to educate all those involved with trying to eradicate that system, that where the history of that likely has come from.
So that's a great point. The importance of how language matters. And so often, I mean, we're in rooms, and I think when you hear stuff like slaves or at risk and underserved, it's like, how do we begin? And I think that's something that everyone can look at to say, what language are we using when we're entering into partnership? And is it the kind of language that will help to build trust? Will it be the kind of language that will invite and encourage conversation, or will the language distance us? And so can you talk about, Jill, can you talk about the importance of language and some of the language that is used, and how can we use the type of language that will help facilitate the types of conversations that's needed to help move us forward in improving our relationships with Black and Brown communities?
Yeah, I think that's very important. And so, I tend to think of things being access and asset limited versus at risk, because our job is to increase access, which eventually would improve or increase the assets. And so, but the language is, okay, you're really coming from nothing, and so you're at risk, and you limited capacity. And, I really have, and we've talked about this. We're fortunate on this panel that we talk all the time. And so Robert knows some of the things that I feel about certain things. So we talk all the time about capacity. What can we do to improve capacity when we happen to know that the capacity is there? But what are we going to do to open up the space where the capacity is valued? And so the language has to shift and change. One of the things that Stephanie said that resonated with me was about the enslaved and the slaved. And that's why when I say capacity, I know capacity isn't the issue, because I had the opportunity to go to Jafari. Jafari is the birthplace of Kunta Kinte. Everybody knows Kunta Kinte. And so we went to Jafari, and we went on a boat. The boat left early and left some of the Black Americans, as they call us, and the Coast Guard took us. The captain of the Coast Guard, the captain of the Marine Service, all Black. Capacity isn't an issue. And so we have to reflect on ways that capacity and language is opened up, and the space is there that express things as they are, instead of in the limited view of what you know. And I, when we had this discussion the other day, I reminded everyone, it's not my job to make people uncomfortable about what you know. I feel bad about a lot of things now, but my pain isn't the same as yours. Your pain is coming from this place of, oh my gosh, how did we get here? My pain is, oh my gosh, I'm here. Oh my gosh, I'm afraid. Oh my gosh, more trauma. And so language is very, very important, as you said, Robert. And also it's important that in terms of remedies, I like the cohort models. I like for nonprofits to be together and say, this is what I've learned, and this is what I'm good at, and this is easily what I can transfer to you, instead of having an external person come and do this. Let's do this all together. Cohort strategic planning is an excellent tool to do some of these things, but language has to be addressed, and we just have to be very careful, as I am sometimes with my tongue. We're all in a space of improvement and wanting to get to a better place. We start individually with how we say things and how we define people.
Thank you, Jill. Albert, I want to come to you, because when we're trying to have these conversations, these can be difficult conversations to have. And so how have you all at Richmond Memorial Health had the conversation about, one, race, equity, social justice, and then the whole intersectionality of race on issues that your foundation supports, such as health? So can you talk about that and how you all been able to have that conversation and tough conversation about race? Because I think a lot of times people say, well, where do we start? Because people don't want to offend, and they're trying to but they want to talk about it. So how have you all been able to talk about race and have a real honest conversation about race as you deal with how it impacts health disparities in Black and brown communities?
Yeah, definitely address that. I do want to say something that I really agree with what Jill said about language around access and how we should increase access for Black and brown communities to get at, our philanthropic purpose, right? When we think about Black and brown grassroots communities, and we talk about capacity, and I agree with you, Jill, that, we talk a lot about capacity. And so I think the capacity is bidirectional, so how much capacity do we have to work in these communities? If we're honest with ourselves, we don't have a lot of good capacity to work in these communities. And so the question for us is to ask ourselves, how are we building our capacity to work in these communities? And so then if we ask that question seriously, we have to interrogate some things about our own practices and policies, kind of getting back to what Mark was kind of getting at. And when we talk about, our policies and practices, oftentimes Black and brown communities are not involved in the philanthropic space because when we look at our practices and policies, they prevent them from being able to enter the door. They don't have access to it. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is this the case? Who's really benefiting from this policy? Who's really benefiting from this practice? And if we hold true to this positive deviance idea, but the solutions are coming from people, what are we missing? Could it be that, Richmond's childhood poverty is the way that it is because we have not invited these voices to the table in a way, and the problems in Petersburg, Jill, have we not invited the right people to the table to help us think about these questions? And so that leads me into like the next thought about, difficult conversations. I mean, it starts with our board. I mean, our board, unfortunately, we had a trustee member who challenged us to really think about it as a whole foundation. So board and staff together going through racial equity training and conversations. We had a big one last week. I was like, man, did I share too much in the last racial equity conversation? But they're difficult conversations because when we talk about things like race, I mean, we haven't normalized conversations around race, wherein we don't give enough people space and grace to kind of learn and, really talk about how we're all affected by it. White people are afraid to be racist. Black people, are afraid to sometimes, talk about race. Yeah, some of them are racist too, and haven't dealt with their own internalized racism. And to be quite honest, we haven't even invited, in many ways, the brown community in honest dialogue and in ways we haven't done. I mean, we're just tapping into the brown communities, and my voice is wavering a little bit because I'm if we continue to do in communities what we've done in Black communities, the brown communities are going to have some of the same outcomes that we see in Black communities, and that will be on our hands. And so we even have to ask ourselves, who are the brown voices in philanthropy in Richmond? Can we even say that? And so, and again, I appreciate, the conversation earlier that we, it's a long journey, but there are some things we can do. One, we can start having more difficult conversations. We can, too, begin to start normalizing conversations. Conversations like this, where we can have open and honest, and then we need to get in rooms together or virtual rooms together and really talk about these thorny issues. And then there's work that I have to say it, white people have to do. I really appreciated Mark just being open and vulnerable about how he said how, he's been working in the sector for so long, and he's done work over the last 10 years to have a new lens. And so we need everybody to do their work. We gotta come together around this. So our foundation is doing the conversations, but I think other organizations and people, and if you're a CEO, if you are a middle manager, if you are someone who's working in an organization, you got to begin to figure out how to carve out space for that and have some elasticity in your organization to hold these conversations. I mean, I think the other fortunate thing that we have at the foundation, sometimes, I have to tell it like it is at our foundation, but the foundation can hold it. It's enough elasticity in there that if I tell them the truth, they can handle it, and I don't feel like my job is threatened. So those are some things that I think we need to explore.
So
Just one thing.
go ahead, Jill.
On just one thing about what Albert said. We tend to do this a lot and say, have people come to the table. Let's be careful where the table is. I'm not, we need to go out instead of having people always come in, because their comfort level, we're comfortable in that space, but everybody isn't. And so let's make sure that we put the table somewhere that everybody's comfortable in talking, that everybody feels the same.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Thank you, Albert. I just wanted to add to it's so critical you talked about those conversations. We embarked on DEI conversations in the midst of COVID, where Sherry and myself met with small groups of the staff that weren't necessarily on the same team. And what came out of those discussions, they happened over the course of, I think, a month and a half, was there were some really uncomfortable conversations. But what you said about the elasticity of the conversation and people feeling like, even if it may have been perceived in a certain way, well, the fact that people were okay with sharing their true feelings around this, and the dialogue was there. But the beauty of it to me was everyone wants to do it again, wants to continue to have those conversations. I believe that's kind of where it works. So then I feel like when people feel empowered as we all go back to our missions, right? What we have to do in our seats to contribute to our work, we're going to take that knowledge along with us. And I would say too, I totally agree with you around the brown population and how us too, we're breaching on that. We just launched Latinx Fund Initiative, but it's like, again, we say the long journey, there's so much more to do. So I just wanted to point out that I wanted just to concur that the communication, having the open dialogue, cultural awareness, even hurting each other's feelings, but doing that in a way through compassion is how we're going to learn. Is how we're going to pivot. Is how we're going to be empowered to make the true difference in philanthropy that needs to happen. And in terms of businesses, for me, I think about we're in philanthropy, and I know there's some corporate social responsibility hats, but then in business in whole, really you in that space, having the space for real, true conversation, real voice to be heard. I think we talked about this a while ago. Jill Coleman mentioned, having some Black and brown people in decision-making opportunities, but then look back at philanthropy in terms of how can your staff, your managers, your VPs sit in on some of these conversations that philanthropy convenes. How can they sit on some of the boards that these nonprofits are serving Black and Brown people? And then empowering those staff and VPs and middle managers to go back and to share their experiences of what they heard, but take heed of the true issues and really massage the way that we do our work in a different way through a different lens. We can't go back to where we were doing things before.
Thank you. So one of the things that you all have talked about, I think that was a key point here, is the idea of not just looking at the capacity of Black and Brown communities, but looking at the internal capacity of your philanthropic organization. And that is important to be able to do that work, because if we look at that, we realize that a large part of what we have to do is internal, right? Whether it's our staffing, whether it's governing, our programming, our policies, our grant making. It is really looking at how do you build our capacity. And so we have about 10 minutes left, and I really want to ask this question as we think about with this 10 minutes left, so we can ask some questions. This is the last thing I want to ask you, then turn it over for questions. What advice would you give those who want to work with being an ally and supporting issues and being engaged and working for Black and Brown communities and with Black and Brown communities to bring about systemic change? What does it take to be an ally and working with Black communities to bring about social justice and systemic change? So Jill, I'm gonna let you answer that first.
Well, one of the things that I do all the time is I have a mentor, and I try to be, and I have a mentee. And it's cliche-ish, and as cliche-ish as it sounds, it's very important. We cannot always elevate ourselves to the moment, but there are others who have done it and done it well, and have also had dual roles in community and had challenging positions at work, have been in corporate structures, have been in philanthropic offices, but also have reached in and not down, reached into communities and said, what do you need, and help me transfer that information. And that has to be a clear, transparent conversation as well. And that can be an uncomfortable conversation. My phone and door stuff is open at the foundation, but then somebody may call me and say, Jill, that wasn't right. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And so, but because I did not necessarily transfer the need the way was best for that community. And so those are the things in terms of being an ally. Make sure that you know what you're talking about. Make sure that you're on the right side of it, but also make sure that you're able to transfer also communication around, this is the only step that I could make, and it's the best step for now. Let's keep talking, and we can move this further. So being an ally, you have to have some big ears, and you have to have a big heart as well.
So that's an important part of being an ally. And this is the last one, and Albert, I'm going to let you answer this one. A lot of times we talk about we're not going to grant our way out of these long-term systemic issues. So in addition to funding, what are other ways in which philanthropy can leverage its influence to support issues impacting Black and Brown communities?
Oh man, there's so many ways other than funding. So one, you could be a matchmaker. So think about your corporation has power, swag, relationships. What could your organization do to link communities of color to other social networks? Part of the problem that we have is that our networks are not shared appropriately. So what could you do as an institution to bring prominence? How could you be a cheerleader for an organization if to bring or raise awareness to give other organizations some opportunity? Capacity building. I think that we say that a lot, but that goes both ways. One, that's also being an ally. Develop your capacity first before you start other people's capacity. I will say, there's another place where like deal makers. I think some of our best business minds are in a lot of these corporations who understand how to put together complex deals and contracts. What would it look like if you took that expertise and helped the community develop deals that benefits them in ways that's still complex, but you bring your expertise to kind of build the beneficiary, to really support where they're going. And then I think the most important piece here is, I think about like being a systems engineer. So, Mark shared a lot about what we need to do to think about the system. And I think we really do need to start taking a step back and looking at all the players in the system. And we do that in business well. We understand how the system works for our business and our bottom lines, right? But then now we need to really take a step back and start to think about how we might move and get at some of the root causes in the system, as opposed to just thinking small about focusing on these problems. And so that's going to take a different kind of investment. It will take both philanthropic, but it also would take a different kind of ethic, a way of being and doing in community, and a way of showing up. And so this is my invitation, because I don't know when the next time I'm ever have the opportunity to say that we're looking for allies. Communities are looking for allies. Let's get in conversation. Let's get in not just conversation, but let's start planning together. But then let's act together in ways that make good sense. And so that's how you do things other than funding.
Thank you. We'll open it up for questions as we are waiting for questions. We have 5 minutes left, and so we want to take questions. And as you think about this, just remember that while no one can do everything, everyone can do something. And so just start asking yourself, what commitment are you willing to make to help be a part of this solution, and what commitment are you willing to make to be an ally in helping to create a more equitable and just Richmond for all persons to have an opportunity and a fair chance to be successful and to thrive. And so with that, we want to open it up to questions, and please use your chat feature. We got about 5 minutes so we can take a few questions.
I guess we left everything on the table, huh, Robert?
Well, the first question is, what is an easy first step we can suggest to allies who want to get involved? I think an easy first step is to acknowledge. I think you got to acknowledge the injustices or the systemic issues that exist. Because I think a lot of times it's like people are wary and they don't want to talk about it. I think the first thing is being able to acknowledge, and Mark said this, acknowledging the privilege. And so I think that's one of the first things you can do to be an ally, is to acknowledge. And then, as they said earlier, be open to listening and learning. Be willing to do that. And so, Jill, can you talk a little bit more about this, this idea about what you said about using the language instead of at risk? Someone said, what is even the language you use? Because that's something else we can do, is change our language. Someone said, can you share that again real quickly?
I think the language is access limited and asset limited, because a lot of what we've talked about all, the last hour or so, and beginning with Mark, was around access. He talked about Obamacare and, how political it became, but also people were forgetting that these folks did not have access to health care. And so though it had some unpopular features, it provided access to so many people that didn't have it. So it was access limited. It wasn't just poverty or poor health. It was access. So it was, we can start talking that way about limited access and asset limited. We're not going to change things until we recognize that no one wants to be in the space they are of having nothing or having no resources. I believe that, and I've said it for so long, that every mother wants the same thing for her children, whether she's on crack or she's in the president of a foundation. Believe it or not, she wants the same thing for her children: access to proper health care, access to good education, access to proper housing. And so it's a matter of access and assets versus the at-risk factors. That's what I would dwell
on. Thank you. I think they said that's our last question that we could take, and just want to recommend, someone said, and this is a great book that's out right now, is Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. Also in a couple of weeks, on the 17th, in partnership with LMR, the Robbins Foundation, will have Nicole Hannah-Jones here, the author of the 1619 Project. And so she will be here as we'll continue conversation looking at equity and education. And so those are a couple of resources, and you can definitely visit Ujima Legacy Fund or Sister Fund and those websites. More information on Amandla. You can visit that at the Community Foundation website. And of course, you can visit Richmond Memorial Health Foundation, Cameron Foundation, and the Community Foundation or the Robbins Foundation. And also, I will just recommend, with the Southeastern Council of Foundations, SECF has an equity hub where it has a number of resources that are available if you're interested in being a part of these conversations on understanding equity and how to be an ally and be a part of this solution. And with that, the Giving Black report will be coming out on the 19th as well. And I will turn it over to Sherry. Thank you for your time. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Sherry.
Thank you, Robert, Albert, Stephanie, and Jill. I think I can say on behalf of probably everybody participating in this that we are so fortunate to have your leadership and the work that you all are doing. I have no doubt that we will be able to overcome a lot of our challenges and be in a better place and reimagine our region to be a place for everyone, but we can do that because of all of you. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time. So we're going to put up on the Mentimeter as we slide into the 3 o'clock hour. Wanted to ask the question, how will what you learned today from Mark and our local philanthropists change the way we think about how we should collectively invest in our community? So if folks want to share that, we'll have a couple of quick comments about that and then move on. It's a lot of information that came out you all today. Have any? Oh, here we go. Excellent. Long-term funding. The idea of scale, doing more together to get greater impact will be important. The need to be focused in giving and not adopt the confetti approach. That was a really interesting comment. It's alignment and pulling resources to be able to make the difference together. Great thought on knowledge of wealth about my Black community with those who have no experience. This opportunity where we need to learn from each other and be willing to have the tough conversation. Really great. And the other highlight around, as much as the work we're trying to do in our African American and Black communities, we need to be mindful of our brown communities and make sure that we are all working together to serve both those communities well. And this idea about more and more what most of these comments are around collective impact and our ability to work together. So thanks everyone for sharing. And we appreciate your input to the session this afternoon. At this point, I get to introduce Hunter Applewhite, from Dominion, who as one of our major sponsors, to provide some remarks. And thanks all for letting me participate this afternoon.
I want to say thank you to the Chamber for a fascinating discussion in a very important series. My colleague Ed Bain, president of Dominion Energy Virginia, said something important just a few days ago. He said, it's times like these we need to focus more on the values that bring us together and look for ways to find common ground. Ed was right. You know, philanthropy, doing good works, is definitely something we can all agree on. I've certainly never met anybody who's opposed to it. And while we can have interesting conversations about the best ways to practice philanthropy, nobody would ever suggest we shouldn't help those who need it. In fact, helping those in need is what the Dominion Energy Charitable Foundation is all about. Last year, Dominion Energy and its charitable foundation provided over $48 million to support charitable causes in more than 20 states. And our employees volunteered 131,000 hours of their own time to serve worthy endeavors. This year's been a challenge in many ways. We all know that. We've tried to step up and lend a hand where we could. We've donated more than $1 million to nonprofits providing COVID relief. And Ed has already told you about the tens of millions of dollars we've committed to social justice and equity in education. Our accomplishments in diversity and inclusion, and our commitment to do even more. For us, none of this is peripheral. It's central to our vision of building a clean and sustainable energy future. Because sustainable means sustainable for everybody. It has to. We know that businesses cannot thrive in communities that are struggling. So we want to help ensure that all people have the means to flourish. And as always, we welcome dialogue about the best way to do that. One of our company's core values is embrace change, and that applies to philanthropy as well. The next great idea could turn up in the next community meeting or casual conversation. So if you have thoughts you'd like to share with us, drop me a line. I'd love to hear from you. So thanks to the Chamber for allowing Dominion Energy the privilege of sponsoring this summit. And thanks to all of you for the great work that you do.
Thank you, Hunter, for those comments, and more importantly, for Dominion, Capital One, MCV Foundation for making the resources possible to make today possible. All I can say is, wow, what a 2-hour conversation that, you know, leaving last week's wonderful conversation, you always wonder what will be the takeaway for the next one. And thanks to our wonderful partners, our panelists, our speakers, today's been equally, if not more so than last week. We are building, which is what we wanted to accomplish through this series. So thanks to all our panelists, specifically Robert Dortch, Jill Coleman, Stephanie Glenn, and Albert Walker. You guys are phenomenal. We look forward to being your allies and working more together. I mentioned our sponsors, but I also want to mention our community partners who have lended a phenomenal hand to this exercise in providing input and conversation with us. The Community Foundation for Greater Richmond, Lead Virginia, LMR, Leadership Metro Richmond, Metropolitan Business League, Plan RVA, Richmond Memorial Health Foundation, Robbins Foundation, and Startup Virginia. Without these partners and so many others, this content would not be possible and this conversation would not be possible. So thank you all as participants for being with us. This 2 hours is a long time. As you all felt like I did, it went fast because these folks were really helping us have the conversations we need to have about real issues. Let me just throw out something I'm learning from Leadership Virginia. We do a reflection after every session. And today, as I reflect on this conversation in last week's, as I prepare for next week's third session, which will be Accelerating Minority Business Growth and Development, the reflection I have relates to a movie that I watched over the last 2 nights, because it was a long movie, to take my mind off other things that were in the news. This movie is called The Free State of Jones. It stars Mahershala Ali and Matthew McConaughey. It is a powerful movie. It does what Hollywood does so best, in the sense that it takes us away from the reality for a minute. It transports us to another time, and it makes very clear what was happening that you just can't read in a book. I challenge you to read that, to watch that movie and think about it or reflect on it into the conversation we're having right now. In one part of the movie, there's a phrase that I think Mahershala says, "No one can own a child of God." be together next week for big ears, big hearts, and another conversation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.